Hi, class. I'm going to briefly touch on the elements of drama. All right. So there are three criteria in which we can use the literary elements, things that we have already discussed, right? Plot, character. But since drama is meant to be performed, there are some other things to look at, like the technical elements and the performance, how the performance is laid out. All right. Little history. So Aristotle was a Greek philosopher whose writings still influence us today. He was the first to write about the essentials of drama more than 2,000 years ago. And his list, right, he came up with 6 elements: plot, theme, character, dialogue. We are familiar with those. Music and rhythm, a little bit different. While music is often featured in drama, in this case, Aristotle was referring to the rhythm of the actors' voices as they speak. I'm thinking of some of Shakespeare's plays. Characters who are of a lofty status or class, sometimes they would speak in iambic pentameter. Whereas the other characters, or the lowly ones, would speak in regular prose. So that's something, from that era. I'm not sure about contemporary drama. All the plays that I've seen, there wasn't really none of that going on. Spectacle, this refers to the visual parts of the play, right? The sets, the costumes, special effects. Now, this is how we look at it in the modern theater. Characters, plot, theme, dialogue, convention, more on that in a minute, genre, and audience. All right, so the modern theater. So here's what's new, right? The convention are the techniques and methods used by the playwright and director to create the desired stylistic effect. Genre refers to the type of play. Some examples of different genres include comedy, tragedy, mystery, and historical play. Whereas Aristotle basically broke them down to 2, tragedy and comedy. So things have evolved. Audience, right? This is a group of people who watch the play. Many playwrights and actors consider the audience to be the most important element. Sometimes the audience becomes part of the play. Maybe you've heard the term broken down the fourth wall. That's, part when the audience, sometimes the characters talk to the audience. Sometimes the audience gets to become part of the play as well. I want to focus on convention. Right? These are the techniques and methods used by the playwright and director to create the desired stylistic effect. I'm going to show you 2 examples of the classic Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to show parts of the prologue, and I want you to notice how they are different.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventures, piteous overthrows, do with their death bury their parents' strife.
In dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now.
All right, so hopefully you saw the difference. The first one was more true to the original. You heard the language, the Elizabethan language, and the traditional, props, costumes, and things like that. Whereas the second one, if you're not familiar, was the movie that starred Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, which I think was pretty cool. So it's set in a modern day setting, but the director, not the playwright here, decided to continue to use the same language. So the language is the same, but the setting is different. Now, later on, after we watch Othello, we will watch a modern day version of Othello. And everything has changed. The setting, the language. The only thing that's different, the only thing that's the same is the actual plot. So the point I'm trying to make here is that just because maybe you've seen a production of Othello, right? It doesn't mean that if another one came around, it would be of the same experience, right? So the playwright sometimes takes a creative liberty. And in today's world, part of that is to cut. These plays were a lot longer, and many times when you see a play today, especially a Shakespeare play, it's a lot shorter than what it was, and that's basically to compensate for our attention spans that seem to be dwindling away. All right, so these are things that we touched on earlier in the semester. Literary, right? The elements, the plot structure, right? The exposition, right? The event that gets the story going, number one. The preliminary event, whatever takes place before the action of the play that is directly related. Then we have the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the denouncement. All right. Some other literary things to pay attention to, as I just mentioned, the exposition, the who, when, where, and what part of the play. How is the story organized? Is it chronological? Are there flashbacks? There's always a conflict, right? What kind of conflict? Is it person versus his or herself, person versus environment, and suspense, a feeling of uncertainty as to the outcome used to build interest and excitement on the part of the audience. Language, right? Sometimes a play is, language is very important, as I mentioned. Some characters will speak in a certain way that separates them from others, depending on class, race, maybe something like that. Style, right? The costumes, the settings. So we saw a little bit of style difference in those two examples of the prologue from Romeo and Juliet. And two things, that are kind of unique to drama. A soliloquy, which is a speech given by a single actor who is alone on stage. And a monologue, a long speech made by one actor. And the monologue can be delivered, right, in the midst of some other characters. And the play Our Town, right, has a famous monologue by one of the main characters, Emily Webb. All right. Now, technical, right? That's all the equipment, right? The curtains, the flats, the backdrop, platforms, things like that. Costumes, props, right? Anything that appears on stage, right? From a telephone to a train. So other technical elements, we got lights, sound, and makeup. Now, as you'll see when we watch Our Town, Thornton Wilder kind of went against the grain a bit. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, some performance elements, acting, some people make the argument that you can't really know a person, unless you see them or are around them. Why? Because certain things they say, maybe they use a body language, different kinds of voice inflection and things like that. This is dramatic literature. Drama is, I mean, it's basically life, right? It's a recreation of life. So characters have motivations, right? Usually in a tragedy, a character will have some sort of tragic flaw, which is the genesis of that motivation. Character analysis, you know, we're still using those same dramatic elements, right? Or the literary things that we talked about earlier. You know, round characters, flat characters, things like that. And sometimes the playwright, right, through a character wants us to feel empathetic towards a certain character. All right. Some other things you want to pay attention to: speaking, right, how the lines are delivered, breath control, vocal expression. So when you are evaluating a play, right, how do the actors compensate for this? You know, especially, you know, during Shakespeare's plays at the Globe Theatre in London, there were no microphones, amplifiers, right? So the characters really had to speak. They had to project their voices. And, you know, what kind of words did they say? Are they clear? Things like that. And finally, you know, things that you don't get in a story or a novel, the nonverbal expression, as I talked about earlier, those gestures and those facial expressions that could sometimes be funny, right? Sometimes show that a character is feeling angst, any kind of emotion, things like that. Thanks for listening.